Welcome to another episode of Senior Flicks. Really excited to have you tuning in with us today. And I'm especially privileged and honored to have a guest with us today that I consider a very good friend, David Kennedy. And David and I have known each other for a long time and have spent some personal time and enjoyed some trips and some golf together and had some laughs over the golf. The subject that we are going to be talking about today is something different than that. It's about grief and loss. And on a personal note, David, you have been there in my life when I needed someone to talk to and listen at one of the most discouraging times in my life, and probably one of the most traumatic in the loss of a loved one. And I didn't really know who to talk to or where to go. And at the time, I'm a pastor. And of course, as a pastor, you're supposed to have all the answers, right? You're supposed to know how to handle everything that life throws at you. Well, you're not a pastor very long before you realize that doesn't work, and that's not real life. And with the loss of a niece who died by suicide, and then other family members, I reached a point in my life where I was really suffering, and there were two emotions that I experienced: sadness and a darkness. And you got a call from me, and you were there, and you listened, and you helped. I would like you to be able to share some of those thoughts that you shared with me, and what you've done for others over the years. I'd like you to share that with the seniors who are going to be listening in, but also their children and grandchildren and family, about grief and loss. This is something that you've sort of found yourself gravitated to. I think someone said in an interview with you that it was something that that found you. You may have even said that.
Right.
And just briefly introduce that part of your life.
Well, thanks, Ron, and thank you so much for the opportunity just to be here. And it's an extra privilege for me just to share it with you, and just to have this conversation, because I think these are conversations that we need to have, and if we could find a way to do it better, it would make life a little easier too. But you're right, and maybe a little bit of a background. I too was a pastor for a number of years, and then went and did my graduate work and was hired by Eastern Pentecostal Bible College at the time. Right. And interestingly enough, one of the subjects that I taught was pastoral theology, and part of that, of course, was doing weddings and funerals. Right. And there was a point, and things were going on in my own life around people dying, etc. But I remember one day realizing, as I finished a class, I know everything about funerals. I know how to do funerals. Right. I can do a funeral. That's not the problem. Right. But I don't know anything about grief. I don't know what to do with somebody 6 months or a year from death, and trying to figure out how to support somebody. And I realized that through all of my training and all of my educational experiences, I had never had a chance to talk about grief, to understand it, and yet it's part of life. Right. So that's what actually started me on that journey. Right. And I completed more education. I left the college. I opened private practice and was in that for a number of years, and that's probably when we connected at that time. Yep. And then about 14 years ago, well, actually 15 years ago, I joined Hospice Peterborough. Right. They were looking for a bereavement coordinator to set up their grief programming. And I was there until I retired last May. Right. But I wish I had learned these things earlier in life. So I think this is a great conversation that we've waited way too long to have around grief, because grief is part of our life. Right. right? I mean, we
Yes.
think about, it's not just, and as you mentioned,
Yeah.
it's not just death, is it?
No, it's loss.
It's
right?
loss, and we have lots of that.
Right. And one of the persons who I was reading an article from the Peterborough News, and someone had mentioned David Kennedy is a humble person, but someone that you really are fortunate to get to know. But they also said there's two groups of people that feel that way. Those who know you as a personal friend, and those who know you on a professional level. And those who know you at the professional level will have either met you through your own business when you were doing grief counseling, or at the hospice. And they did say that very different in terms of their personal need in their own life at that point. And I think I've known you at both those levels. And as many of them would say, fortunate to have known you. Talk to us about loss and how the experience of loss through life contributes to grief.
I think one of the greatest challenges around grief is that we have pathologized it, or we have said that it's wrong and something that needs to be fixed. When in fact, grief is part of life. As
right.
you know, I used to tell the students as I taught, I'd say, you know, the very first thing you learned was grief. You came into this world from your mother's womb, and everything was looked after, and all of a
right.
sudden here you are into this big world.
Right.
You've lost all the safety and security. It's one of the first things we recognize as loss. And life is a continuum of loss.
Right.
That's not a bad thing.
Right.
It's the way it's supposed to be. That things change,
right.
and we don't stay the same.
Right.
But what we have done, unfortunately, is that we've had pressure not to allow those losses to be honored or recognized.
Right.
And we try to avoid the feelings that come with loss often.
Yeah.
So in order to avoid those feelings, we try to avoid the whole thing.
Right.
If we could learn that those feelings are in fact a normal part of our living, and that we could live with them in a way that doesn't overwhelm us,
Right.
then life is so much healthier in our living.
Right.
So grief, when we talk about, of course, most people think about grief coming from death, which it does.
Right.
And death is that break of relationship. And that break of relationship introduces this piece of grief in us. But that happens in so many ways in life.
Right.
And maybe we'll talk about one of them in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But non-death loss is part of our living.
Right.
Every day.
Right.
And as we grow older,
We've done that.
we discover that life is filled with those,
Right.
and you can't avoid them.
Right. I was thinking recently. I had to do an article for Sage Magazine for seniors, and I was trying to think about the topic, and I was listening to someone else sharing about a memory as well. And you talk about loss. One of the safe places that I go to in my mind is when I was a child, and I was walking on my grandparents' farm. And I would spend Sunday afternoon often just walking by myself and the dog in the back part of that 100 acres and through the bush and all of the stuff that loss, I don't have that now. Yeah. But I've got the memory of it, right. Which could consume me is what I'm hearing you say, or it can be a natural, normal part of living, and to embrace those, but to allow yourself to move on past those.
Right. It's exactly the way, and so we will talk about a normal process of grief.
Right.
And the truth is, Ron, that the truth is 90% of people, and if we look at death loss, 90% of people are able to find their way through without major complications.
Right.
The biggest challenge I find with a normal processing of grief
Right.
are two things. One, people want it over quickly. They
Yes.
don't like the feelings that it brings, and we want to get
Right.
rid of it as soon as possible.
Right.
And that's where we pathologize it. We say, oh, there's something
Okay.
wrong with me.
Right.
So as a counselor, I would have people come to me in their grief, and and I would be exploring and say, well, what are you finding difficult right now? Well, I'm crying all the time.
Right.
And I would say something, well, your life partner just died. How long were you married? Oh, we were married 50 years. Right. Well, we're 3 months away from her death, and you're sad because you're still crying.
Right.
The problems with grief is, one of them is we want it over too quickly because we don't like the feelings.
Right.
The other thing that we try to do then is we try to have these fixes. So everybody has heard about the 5 stages of grief, right?
Yeah.
And the truth is there are no stages.
Right.
Grief is not like that.
Right.
You don't do this and this and this and then everything's okay.
Right.
I tell people grief is like being at the front car on the biggest roller coaster at Wonderland, and you're going up and down and back and forth.
Right.
And some days you wake up and you say, hey, today's a really good day. And then
Right.
an hour later, it hits you.
Right.
But there's nothing wrong with that. That's normal. That's what
Okay.
happens.
Right.
If we can find a way to live with that, and that's where we come back to when I talk about how do we help people in grief.
Yes. Yeah.
The greatest gift we can give is to listen.
Right.
The greatest gift is to normalize. You know what?
Right.
Yeah, of course you're crying a lot. That's okay.
Right.
And it's okay if you cry with me.
Right.
So normalizing those pieces of our grief as being something that's normal,
Right.
and also recognizing everybody's going to do this differently.
Mm-hmm.
And just because this is what I did doesn't mean that's what you have to do.
Right.
The greatest gift we can give to one another is the ability to listen, to support, to allow them to have what they need that we are able to provide.
Right.
And that is most often our presence. Yeah.
I was reading something from a friend, and I won't mention who, but they had lost a husband, and then their daughters had lost a father, and this was about 5 years ago, and yesterday they celebrated Daddy Day. It was the anniversary of the loss, and so mentioned that they played the music that he loved, not necessarily their music. Right, it's like this was Daddy's music.
Exactly.
And they went for the walk in the woods, and they spent the whole day celebrating Daddy.
Yes. Right.
And that loss, learning how to celebrate it. Talk to us about that, because those feelings are there.
Right.
What steps can we do? And maybe it's not about the loss of a loved one, but it's about the loss of time and aging.
Yeah.
How do I deal with that kind of grief, and what steps can I do?
You said a very important piece in your first illustration and story. One of the things that we do with grief with others, we are uneasy watching other people in pain and suffering. So we try to make it better. So it's very hard to be with people who are talking about their grief, and you are assuming that they're talking to you about it is upsetting them more. And the truth is, and I say this to people, when they say to me, I don't know what to say to somebody who's in grief. And what I will say to them is, there's nothing you can say that's going to upset them more than they already are. So
true.
that example you gave, what a great way to honor, and that's the word I use. Honor that person by playing his music, by going to places that were important to him, by remembering him. So instead of shutting out those things, it's far better to do those things.
To embrace
it. And embrace it. And you're not, and other people might be, especially after after a year. The first year, people will ask you, how are you doing? But after a year, people think, oh, I don't want to bring it up, or I don't want to mention that person's name.
Right.
Because I don't want to upset them.
Right.
When in fact, you give people a gift by talking about them.
Yeah.
Asking about them, asking about their memories,
Right.
asking them to tell stories
Right.
can be the greatest gift that
Yes.
we can give people. So, you know, for me, that piece is so important. The other thing that I think, and I want to tell a story quickly.
Yeah.
I had a client when I was in practice. He was in his late 40s, and he was one of 6 brothers. And he wanted me to talk to their father. And their father, who was in his 90s, and he and his wife had owned a farm, and all the kids had grown up on the farm. And Mom had died 5 years before this, and so Dad was alone at the farm. His health was good, but he was quite the guy. He had written a book, very articulate, but he was getting to the point where he no longer could stay alone. So the boys had sold the farm with him, his permission, and was moving him into a beautiful retirement home.
Right.
But the son said to me, "Dad won't talk. He hasn't talked to us for 3 months. Can you talk to him?" So he brought his dad in,
Right.
and I said, "Okay, we'll be an hour, and you can come back and pick him up." Right. So he said, he looked at me just as we were going into the office, and he was shaking his head, and he said, "It's going to be a pretty long hour because he's not talking."
Right.
So anyway, we get in there, and he's sitting there, and I didn't say anything for about 30 seconds.
Right.
And finally, he said to me, "They think I'm stupid, you know." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, they think I don't get it. They think that I don't realize that the only way that I'm going into this place is because I have to. And the only way I'm coming out of that place is because I'll be dead." And all I want to do is talk about what that feels like to leave my home.
Wow.
And all of that. But all they're trying to tell me is how wonderful it's going to be in this new place.
They're trying
and
to sell
Dad,
them
you're
on
going to
it.
get to go on bus trips and all the, all the
Right.
normal things
Sure.
that we will encourage.
Sure, right.
But the point that I'm making is
Yes.
that we have to take time. So I'll finish the story. He never shut up for 60 minutes. I don't think I said more than 10 words. And he was talking about his memories and all of
Right,
the important
right.
things. At the end of it, he looked at me and he said, "Now, this is all confidential, right?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." He said, "You can't tell my son we talked." I said, "No, we can't." So when we walked out, and his son was in the waiting room, and so he walks out, and the son said to me, "So did Dad talk?" And I said, "You'll have to ask him." So as they were going out the door, his father turned around, gave me a wink, and goes like this, right? But the point that it made to me was that, we're so quick to try to get people
Fixed.
fixed.
Right? Yes. Yeah.
And what all he needed, and I think for most of
Right.
us, is to have those losses validated.
Right,
It
right.
doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that I'm not going to want to do this.
Right.
But can you give me a chance to talk about how hard it is to leave this?
Right.
And
right.
and I think those are the pieces
Yes.
as we grow older. I know it's true in my
Right,
life.
right.
And we've,
Same.
as you say, we've things change. Life changes so
Right,
fast.
right.
And it's not that I can't adapt to change, but it's also important for me to recognize I miss those walks in the farm
Right,
with my
right,
dok.
right.
And I that was a special time for
Yeah.
me. And it's okay for me
Yeah.
to tell that story and to
Right.
tell people I feel both gratitude and joy that I did
Right.
it, but I also am sad that it came to an end, right?
Right. And who do you talk to? I've fairly recently, I guess it was a year or two ago, I was thinking about, a couple of good friends of mine passed away, and you knew both of them, and there were people I told my stories to.
Yeah.
They knew my story, right? The younger generation, even my children, they respectfully listen at times, but in the context of my friends and I sitting around the table or in the living room with the family, and we're telling the same story. Oh, we've heard this story before, and it's like, it's so true. But as your friends move on and they pass away, your story comes to an end.
Yep.
In a sense that, who do I tell the story to that's really listening?
Yeah.
And as you said, and in fact, it might not be true, as in the case of the father and the son, but who really cares to listen?
Yeah. Right.
And so what I'm hearing you say is, take the time to listen.
Stories are so important.
Right.
I remember saying this to I have two brothers, as you know.
Yes.
And I remember when Dad died when he was 85.
Right.
And we had just moved Mom and Dad into we built them a granny flat in the back of my younger brother's house. And Dad and Mom moved in September. And then Dad died the following February. And I just think he wanted to make sure Mom was safe. But I remember having this conversation with both my brothers at the wake, and I said to them, the last 2 years of Dad's life, he was telling more stories that I'd never heard of. Right. And I said, maybe he told them before. Maybe I was just listening for the first time.
Right.
But it was so, now as I look back, I'm so thankful that he told those stories.
Right.
And you're right. I think young people, when we're really young, we're not listening the way, they're not as important.
Right.
But as we grow older, I think hearing those stories from older people than us, there's something significant about that. And I think it's incredibly significant for us to tell the story. Right. So I always encourage seniors to say, tell the stories to the grandkids. So one of the things I'll say when I had a grandchild about a grandparent death, and there still is one remaining, I will really say to that child, okay, do you know how your grandparents, do you know how they met? Do you know about their first date?
Right.
Do you know where they went on their honeymoon? Right. And they'll often say, no, I don't. I said, there's your choice. You go, and I want you to ask those questions. Right. I want you to get to know their story, because their story is part of your story. Right. And I think our stories are so significant. Yeah. And that's how we find meaning. That's how we understand life. How we find our place in the world is through our story in this world. Right. And stories have really hard chapters. Yeah. They have devastating chapters. They have joyful chapters. All of our life, if we look at our life as a book, there's so many different chapters that have so many different emotions attached. Right. And loss is part of our story. Right. And rather than hide it or try to minimize it, putting loss into perspective, what did that mean? So what did you learn? You have emotions from being on your grandparents' farm. Right. But what did you learn from that experience? What did you learn about what's important in life? Right. So our stories can teach us. Yeah. That's why I say to seniors, you have so much valuable pieces of life. Right. You need to share them while you can. Right. And we've laughed at that story, and we've all experienced it. We were going through some pictures. My wife, she was going through some pictures that her sister had found from their family, and we were holding in this picture, and I said, "Well, who's that?" She says, "I don't know who that is. Right. If Mom or Dad were here, they'd tell me." Right. Exactly. So there's all of these pieces that we need to find those connections. Right. And so I really encourage senior people, you may think your life doesn't have connection. Right. You may think that you don't have any way to really make a difference in a young generation. Right. Tell your story. Your stories. How did you survive life? Right. Even I will often say to kids, when their elderly parents die, I say, if the child who I'm talking to maybe they're 38 or 39, and I'll say to them, what do you think your mom was doing when she was your age? You know, what do you think it was like for her or your father? What was life like for them at the age you are now? Because we never think of our parents at our age, right? But the truth is, they've lived that.
Yes.
So what have they, even although the world was different, there's a sense that the world isn't different.
It's almost like it's coming around again.
So what did they learn?
Right? Yes.
What did they have? How can they help us? And telling this, and if we can tell story without needing it to be a fixing. I'm not telling you this to tell you how to do it. I'm telling you this is how I did it. This is my life. This is my story. Maybe you can learn from my story and look at it. But grief and loss are those pieces in the story where we really find a pause. And I think that allows us then to make sense of life in a way that so many other things don't.
You know, the grief in the story and the legitimacy of that, the normalization of it, is something we haven't done well.
We have not done well. And Ron, we have not done well in the church. We have not done well to, and I'll say this carefully, but you know, we as a pastor, and I've been there, you know, we're so focused on getting people into heaven and what will happen after death, that we don't help them with the experiences of death that we all live through. And even, you know, that piece of around that. So I think we can, you know, there's people who feel like I can't go to church and talk about my sadness because, you know, after all, that person's in a better place. That's the language we use. Well, you know, the truth is that no, a better place would be here with me. You know, so we could have our relationship again. But and I understand that about heaven. But I am saying that we have shut down grief by telling people not to feel that way. And we do feel that way. So what happens is we drive that underground, and we're not allowed to say how we really feel.
And to apply a Band-Aid to it, or a quick fix, or a prayer. Let's just pray, and it'll be okay.
And it'll be okay.
And I remember a friend of mine who was going through significant grief, and you were working with her, and someone saying to her, "Look, it's been a year. Get over it." And it's like she was so dumbfounded that a pastor would say, "Just get over it." And yet, in fairness to him, it's what he was taught as well, right? This is an uncomfortable emotion because we're supposed to have it all together. We're supposed to, when we get saved, and that spirituality that starts to happen through the Spirit and God, we're okay. We've got it all together now, and we realize in life we don't. And it's in the midst of those grieving periods that we realize the truth of that. And some people say, well, I'm not comfortable in church because I make people uncomfortable with my messiness and my sense of loss. So thank you again, and thank you for listening to this session with us, and we will come back with more from David.